For more than 2 centuries, there's been this one single sentence in the U.S. Constitution that's basically a giant puzzle. It shaped the entire balance of power between the states and the federal government. And what's wild is that this puzzle, it started with old-timey shipping routes, but now it touches literally everything you do online. So yeah, let's dive right in.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. What if one of the most important rules for how an entire country runs was just left vague? Maybe on purpose, maybe not. Who knows? But that's exactly the mystery we're going to unravel today. A constitutional puzzle that's been in play since 1789.
All right, so here's the plan. First, we'll break down the puzzle itself. Then, we'll see how the first lines were drawn in the sand. After that, we'll get into when those lines got, completely blurred. And finally, we'll bring it all into our world, the digital age, to see why this whole thing matters more than ever right now.
Okay, let's get into it. Our journey starts right there, in the words of the U.S. Constitution, where there's this huge problem just hiding in plain sight.
There it is, the famous Commerce Clause. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. But here's the kicker. The one tiny detail the founders left out, they never actually told us what commerce is.
So here's the deal. The Constitution basically created 2 big buckets for power. You've got interstate commerce, that's stuff happening between states, which Congress gets to regulate. Then you have intrastate commerce, stuff happening within one state, which the state gets to regulate. Simple, right? Well, not so fast, because between those 2 buckets, there's this fuzzy, undefined void, all because nobody ever spelled out the rules.
And that gap, that's what legal experts call a jurisdictional void. It's basically this legal gray area where federal and state power just crash into each other. And for hundreds of years, the courts have been stuck trying to play referee and figure out who's actually in charge of what.
So how did this whole thing play out? Well, in the early days of the country, people had a pretty simple, common-sense way of trying to fill this void.
Yeah, for a really long time, the answer was super straightforward. Commerce just meant things. Actual physical goods getting loaded onto a wagon or a ship and literally crossing a state line. Things like manufacturing, farming, all that stuff. People figured that happened before commerce even started, so it was the state's business, not the federal government.
And because of that super narrow definition, you can kind of see how things shook out. Federal power? Pretty limited. The states? They had a ton of authority over their own economies. And that jurisdictional void we've been talking about, it was just a tiny little crack, mainly because most business was local anyway. But then, everything changed. A massive national crisis came along and basically forced a complete rethinking of that one little sentence in the Constitution. And that tiny crack we mentioned, it blew wide open.
So, you have the Great Depression in the 1930s. The country is in turmoil, and there's this immense pressure on the federal government to just do something to fix the economy. This is what leads to the New Deal, and eventually it all comes to a head in a landmark Supreme Court case in 1942, one that would pretty much redefine American government as we know it. In this case, Wickard v. Filburn. This is the moment that line just got completely erased. You have this farmer in Ohio, Roscoe Filburn, and he grows more wheat than a federal law says he can. But he argues, hey, this is just for my own family, my own animals. But the Supreme Court? They said it didn't matter. They reasoned that because he wasn't buying wheat on the open market, he was, when you add him up with other farmers like him, affecting the national price of wheat. And just like that, poof! Commerce wasn't just about things crossing state lines anymore. It was about anything that could even remotely affect the national economy.
I mean, look at the difference here. This was a radical shift. We went from a system with a limited federal government that only dealt with physical goods crossing borders to a system where the federal government had this incredibly broad power to regulate pretty much any economic activity, no matter how local it seemed, as long as you could argue it had a substantial effect on the national economy.
And that brings us to today. Because, look, if one farmer's extra wheat could cause a constitutional crisis, just try to imagine the kind of puzzle we're dealing with in the completely borderless world of the internet.
Yeah, just look at that number. Over $1 trillion in e-commerce. We are so far past wagons and ships, it's not even funny. What we have now is this massive, intangible economy that moves at the speed of light. It doesn't care about state borders. And it has created a brand new jurisdictional void and a whole new world of legal headaches.
And this just raises all these new, almost impossible questions. Like, let's say you buy something from a company based in California, but their server's in Virginia, and you're physically sitting in Texas when you click buy. Who gets the sales tax? Or what about crypto? Who regulates digital currencies that exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time? Is a stream of data even commerce to begin with? The old rules, they just don't work anymore. Okay, let's make it even simpler. You buy a digital movie on your phone. Where did that transaction actually happen? Was it on your phone, at the company's main office, on the server farm where the file is stored? The fact that there is no easy answer to that question, well, that tells you everything you need to know about how deep this new digital void really is.
So you might be thinking, okay, interesting history lesson, but why does a 200-year-old constitutional debate actually matter to me? Well, because the answer to this puzzle affects your life in some really direct ways. It connects the dots from the country's founding documents right down to your online shopping cart.
I mean, think about it. Every time this definition shifts, it has a direct impact on the taxes you pay for that thing you just bought online. It's what determines whether a local business down the street has to follow massive federal regulations for things like the environment or workplace safety. This whole debate is at the absolute heart of arguments over how big the government should be. And in the end, it's going to decide who gets to write the rules that protect your privacy online.
So, if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. That fuzzy, undefined void in the Constitution isn't some historical footnote. It's not a problem that got solved and stuck in a textbook. It is a living, breathing debate that is being fought and redefined right now, as we speak, as our economy and our technology keep changing. And that leaves us with one last huge question to think about. In a world that's totally borderless, where data, money, and ideas just flow freely, does that original line between within a state and between states, a line drawn for a world of horses and wagons, does it even make sense anymore? That's the puzzle we are all right now trying to solve.